Hi, everybody, and Shavua Tov. Happy Monday. Let's begin with a blessing to sanctify our learning this morning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And we also have another little liturgical rite that we should fulfill this morning, which is the singing of happy birthday to one of our members, Hannah Jensen. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Hannah. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Hannah.
Thanks, everybody.
We're so glad to have you in this group. You're such an incredible contributor to our Torah. Okay, so we are now pretty close to, this is probably good news for many of us, is we're pretty close to the end of the first Seder of the Mishnah, the first order, the first section of the Mishnah. And that first section is agricultural law. So that's why it's kind of good news, because that stuff often feels very intricate and irrelevant all at once, because most of us are not farmers. And actually, as I say that, I'm already kind of pointing to one of the problems that we're going to deal with today, which is, you know, what we do with all of these laws, we who do not live in the land of Israel. Okay, so today we're close to the end of that. We have one more volume to take a look at, but today we're going to look at the tractate in the Mishnah of Orla, and that is to say, we'll be looking at the commandment, the Mitzvah of Orla, which I want to like put a full description of on hold, but I'll just say briefly that Orla is the mitzvah of not cutting fruit from a new tree for the first 3 years. Okay, that's the basic law. For the first 3 years, you don't cut the fruit from a tree. You only do so in the 4th year. Okay, so we're going to look at that mitzvah, and we're going to try and figure out what it's there for, or what its purpose is, what its spiritual meaning is. But first, I want to take a look at not the Torah's concern, but the Mishnah's concern. We're studying Mishna after all, and the Mishnah has a very particular question, which is when is this commandment of Orla applicable? Okay, so first of all, let me just give you a source sheet here. And we're going to start with a very technical question. Oh, that's not right. We're going to start with a very technical question, and then hopefully soon get into like, well, what is this really all about anyway? Okay, all right. Sorry, I'm just getting your source sheet ready, and it's very annoying because if I don't have HTTP there, then it's not a link. So I spent all this time figuring out how to get HTTP in the URL. Okay, here it is. Okay, so with that, we'll head into the Mishnah. And the first question that the Mishnah asks, the first sort of concern that the Mishnah has, it has to do with, as I said, when does the commandment of Orla apply? When do we do it? Hence the funny title here, which I'll soon explain. The question is, when do we circumcise trees? Okay, so at the time that our ancestors came into the land, if they found a tree already planted, it was exempt from the laws of Orla. If they planted a tree, even though they had not yet conquered the land, it was liable to the laws of Orla. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. So can someone, and this is just like sort of nitty gritty here. Soon we're going to expand into something that I think is is more meaningful. But can someone just give me the law? When does Orla apply? When are you obligated to be careful about trees for their first 3 years? Can someone just speak out what we learned? I think we learned maybe 3 categories.
When Jews planted it.
Give it to us.
When Jews planted the tree, Orla applies.
Okay, that might be the underlying reason. Is it that an Israelite has to plant the tree? This mitzvah doesn't apply unless an Israelite is the one who plants the tree, one of our people. But that's possible, like that might be the underlying reason, but that's not the law that the Mishna stated. When are we obligated in the laws of Orla? Mishnah is not speaking about who plants a tree, but when. Rosa?
Well, I should think it would be, when the tree was planted, if you're planting it yourself.
Okay, so a tree that we can keep track of its full growth, and that also might be the underlying reason, but you all are too sophisticated for me. That is, you're trying to figure out, well, what does this really mean? But what does the Mishnah say? What does the Mishnah just say? Matt Webster.
Yes, I was just thinking that some trees like lemon trees and avocado trees, they kind of fruit partially when they're young, for the first couple of years when they're young. So in general, it's a good idea to leave a tree alone until the fruits are mature.
Again, you're too smart. You're too sophisticated. This is true, and potentially many have speculated that the reason for Orla is that it's good. It's good for a tree to let it fully develop before you start hacking away at its fruit. But again, that's further ahead than my sort of simple mind has gone. And I'm just asking the question, when does the Mishnah say, I'm going to put it back up again, when does the Mishnah say that Orla applies? At the time our when our ancestors came into the land, if they found a tree already planted, it was exempt. If they planted a tree, even though they had not yet conquered the land, it was liable. Okay.
It's in the land of Israel. Trees in the land of Israel.
Okay, but more than that, that's right. Has something to do with the land of Israel. More than that, Matt Silverstein. Matt's like, hey, I really have the answer.
4 years old. Or isn't that what you're looking for?
Nope. I'm looking for just what the Mishnah says. Okay.
That's what it
Anytime
says.
that it takes
We
this long
arrived in
to answer a question, it's because the question was not well formulated. So let me just answer it myself. I'll take responsibility for this confusion. The answer is when the Israelites came into the land of Israel, then from then on, Orla applied. So they're wandering through the desert, right? We're in the middle of that story now, the Exodus. They have a whole, most of the Torah takes place outside of the land of Israel. And in fact, the Torah ends before the Israelites enter the land of Israel. So the Mishnah tells us that when the Israelites cross over into the land of Israel, from then on, any tree that they plant, they have to wait for 3 years. Okay, that's one thing that we learn. The second thing that we learn is, but what about the plants that are already there? Do they have to wait for 3 years before touching any plant? No. Plants that are already there, and some of you, this is why some of you were very perceptively, insightfully speculating on the deeper reasons. Maybe it's because it has to be an Israelite planted tree, but all we learned in that Mishnah is trees that are already there, you can start plucking at right away. Okay? So it's the moment that the Israelites crossed over into the land, suddenly the mitzvah of Orla was, as they say in the tradition, chal, meaning it became activated. And it didn't apply to the trees that were already there. It's just now any tree that you put in the ground, now you have to wait for 3 years. And there was one other detail that we got in that Mishnah, which is, it isn't, you might think that it was, that to enter into the land, meaning, well, not the moment you cross over, but in fact, when you have fully conquered the land and made it Israel, you are now in charge of the land. You've driven out your enemies, right? Remember, there's a whole conquest process, but the Mishnah says no. I'm going to put this up again just so we make it quite clear. It doesn't matter whether you've conquered the land. It's about coming in, it's the actual act of crossing over. Okay? So that's the law. That's the law that we're, in some ways, now we have it. We know the answer to the question, when does the mitzvah of Orla apply? It applies the moment the children of Israel crossed over into the land of Israel. Now anything they planted there would be off limits for the first 3 years. Now, this, what I've asked you, and what the Mishnah has taught us, yeah, we're like now in the business of analyzing the Mishnah. This is, it's good kind of text analysis, but we don't even need to do text analysis, because everything we're saying comes straight from the Torah. The reason that the Mishnah is teaching, the Mishnah is just reminding us what the Torah herself says. And when we see the law of Orla, which we'll now begin to consider, we see that it's introduced with this very principle. Okay, so take a look at this opening phrase here. Here's where the law of Orla appears in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, in the Holiness Code, no less, with famous section in chapter 19 that gives all kinds of laws, including the famous love your neighbor as yourself, right? They're like lots of big laws, but one of them is ki tavo el haaretz, when you enter into the land. Well, there it is. When you enter into the land, not before then, but exactly then, and plant any tree for food, and hence it's not trees that were already there, but trees that you plant for food. Other sections of the Mishnah will say, yeah, that's right, it's for food, and a tree that was planted for other reasons you don't have to worry about, but fruit trees for food. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden for you not to be eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit shall be set aside for jubilation before the Eternal. And only in the 5th year may you use its fruit, that its yield to you may be increased. I am the Eternal your God. Okay? So now I'm going to ask you to do the same thing for the Torah that I asked you to do for the Mishnah, which is just give me the laws. How does it work? There's year 3, year 4, and year 5. What's the law? Can someone just speak it out for me?
Okay, when you walk into the land, even if you haven't conquered, when you first come into the land, you are then obligated. Any tree that you plant, you must wait 3 years, and then the 4th, and then the 5th.
Okay, good. That's right, except you must wait 3 years, don't touch it at all for 3 years, and then in the 4th you do what?
You gather it for an offering for the Jubilee?
That's right. You gather it and you bring it presumably as a kind of an offering, the first fruits, right? That's also a commandment. The first produce will be offered to God. So that happens in the 4th year. And then by year 5, you can just eat off of the fruit of the tree. Okay? All right. So far, technicalities. Now, let's ask the real questions. Why? Why is this so? Why would we do this? We've already heard some beginnings of an answer, and Matt, in fact, gave us a very full answer, which is maybe it's actually good for the tree. This is just good planting procedure. But there's all this spiritual stuff too. Why 3? What's that? Anyone have a read on kind of why would the Torah want us to do this? Yonatan.
So I have kind of an opposite position from Matt's view. I think it's difficult to read the agricultural laws as being intended to optimize agricultural production, because some of them do and some of them don't. The laws, for example, banning companion planting, right? Companion planting is a great way to increase your yield, and the Torah still prohibits it. And so I think more of what's going on here is, and this is something the Torah often does, is it says, you have an opportunity to gain from something. God are the terms by which you are entitled to enjoy God's creation. Sometimes those terms mean you don't take advantage of the resources that are there for you. And that's part of your relationship with the land, and that's part of your relationship with God.
Okay, great. Yonatan has sort of laid out a theory introduced by a counter theory, a sort of critique of a theory, and I happen to agree with Yonatan. That is, these ideas that the laws of the Torah are just sort of like they're hiding more practical concerns with spiritual overlay. I'm always a little bit like, for example, one of the ways that we talk about that is that the laws of kashrut are just for health. They're there for health. It was good not to eat pork back then. You got diseases, right? There's one school of analysis that's like looking for the more practical reason behind the law. And I'm always a little suspicious of that because, as Yonatan says, not all the laws seem to be so practical. And so Yonatan offers a more straightforward, I think, reading of the agricultural laws in general, of the offerings that we've been, the tithes and all of this in general. And we've said this now many times over the last few weeks, but I think Yonatan's right to apply it here, which is that the purpose of this is you don't just get to take. You have to let God's land be. You have to acknowledge that God is the owner of the land before you start taking from the land. Now, don't get me wrong. There may be practical concerns behind it, and there may be a merger of these things, but I think these two concerns, but I think Yonatan is right to say that the suggestion of the verses is that that you do this because you acknowledge God's beneficence, God's abundance, the produce is something that God has given you, and so you hold off from taking too much of it for God's sake. I think that's at least the beginning of an answer. But let's keep going. What else do we think is going on here, Payam?
I think it's also a question of equity. I mean, think of this. They're going to a new land. They don't know what the soil condition is. They don't know what the chemistry is. They don't know where the good land is, where the bad land is. So they let everybody plant something, wait 3 years, see what the yield is. And if some guy got stuck with some bad land with bad soil, he doesn't starve to death. And they can say, okay, then we'll come up with an equitable system of distributing from X to Y or Y to Z. But they don't have any data at this point. So they're really just trying to gather data about the new land they're in.
That's interesting, right? Like that the idea of Orla is a kind of a hold on for the first 3 years. Let's survey the landscape here. Let's see what's available. And let's see how we're going to manage the resources in the society, rather than just okay, everybody off to your plot of land and it's a free-for-all, hope you do well. That's interesting. Alexandra.
I think there's something also about shifting mindset. So these are people who have been wandering, and now they have to stay where they are because they planted the trees and they have to stay there for at least however many years, 5 years before they can eat it themselves. And so I think there's something about just shifting from the wanderer's mindset to, once they came into Israel, to having a rooted mindset and a mindset of home.
Okay, so Alexandra imagines a kind of psychological kind of cultivation, right, to use an agricultural word, where you're kind of bringing your consciousness into a state of being settled, of being at home. And that you're supposed to watch. I love this description, Alex. It's almost like you're watching the tree for 3 years as a way of saying, yes, I'm planting roots here, right? Quite literally. Okay, let's just take one more answer, and then I want to introduce another element. Esra?
So I'm going to do a variation on a theme of what Alexandra just pointed out, which is maybe let's add like a social, maybe even socio-political bent on this, which is, you ever go to a party and like you bring something and you really like what you brought and you're kind of like, I want to eat what I brought to the party, but you kind of like hold back. It's kind of like new. You don't show up and like eat all the chips and dip that you brought. That's kind of rude, you know, like have a little derech eretz, like, you know, like don't be the shmagegi that, you know, just kind of wolfs down everything, you know, like you're the new kid on the block, you know, be gracious. Maybe this has more to do with the derech eretz of hospitality and culture of the Middle East, which is like, you're new, you bring something, you let others enjoy. Of course, I don't really have any text or sources for this. So embedded in my comment is a question for you and others, Rabbi Kasher, which is like, what actually happens to that fruit for the first 3 years? Like, is it just falling on the ground and the birds are attacking it? Like it's like chaval, what happens to that fruit? But I guess the basic point is like, don't be like, you know, don't be like, you know, don't be rude. Don't just show up and eat everything and take as a new person.
Okay, I like this. This is like, you know, I think this complements nicely Yonatan's sort of primary suggestion that this is some recognition of God's gift of food and land and God as the source of any abundance. But Esther adds to that in this particular, that's true for all the agricultural laws, but in this particular case, for many of the agricultural laws, in this particular case, it's like, it's not just acknowledging God first, but also, I love the description, like also in this case, not being grabby when you come in, right? Like being patient, acknowledging God with restraint and not just sort of showing up and taking. So like there has to be some, you show that when you come into the land, you're already thinking about how to farm and to work this land in accordance with your beliefs and your principles and your acknowledgement of something higher. In a quick answer to the question, what do we do with that fruit? The rest of the Mishnah takes us through very, very strict regulations that insist that we do not eat any piece of this fruit. And yes, animals can eat it, but if there's any even doubt that this fruit has been used or incorporated in some kind of meal or even non-food use, then that object is to be burned, right? So really don't touch it at all. It's not just don't pick it, but don't eat any of that fruit. Okay, I want to let Rosa in, who has also a related comment.
Yeah, so that presupposes that this is a one-time only law, that when you first arrive in the land and you plant trees, you have to wait for them to mature. What about if you've been in the land for 10 years and you then decide to plant a tree? Does that law no longer apply? Okay,
the answer is that no, now once you've entered into the land, now that law is a law. And anytime you plant a tree in the land of Israel, now, as I say that, I'm already kind of giving away some of the game here, because it isn't explicit, but it seems to be the case that this is we're talking about the land of Israel, right? It's trees that are planted in the land of Israel. Once the children of Israel made that journey, crossed over the Jordan into the land of Israel, they activated something whereby now when trees are planted in the land of Israel, anytime you have to wait for 3 years, okay? So this idea of like the trees that were already there, that's just like, that's how they lived for the first 3 years, but actually now it's kind of irrelevant because from now on, every tree in the land of Israel is subject to this law. So important clarification. That is at least our working assumption. Soon we're going to question that assumption, but so far we find ourselves in a category of law that largely overlaps with the agricultural system, and that category is mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz. Commandments that depend on being in the land. Okay? These are Israel-based laws. And they weren't applicable until they entered in the land. And then once they are in the land, it's about what's happening, what's growing out of the land of Israel. Okay, that's our working assumption. Now, I want to enter in, like, we've done great work here, trying to figure out, okay, so what's the point of this? Why? What's the ethic? What's the spirituality? What's maybe the practical kind of farming reason behind it? Lots of possibilities. But there is one kind of glaring, or sort of hidden but glaring at the same time, phrase in the law, not even phrase in the law, the name of the law, Orla. We have to think about the word itself, because there's something here that references all kinds of other practices that we've seen before, and that is the word Orla, right here. And by the way, the translation here is, you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden for you. That is not the right translation, but I couldn't think of any way better to translate it, because the word here is va'arlatem arlato, and then again the word for forbidden, arelim lo ye'achel, the things which are arel. So what is arel? Some of you know. I see Yael knows. What is arel?
Well, doesn't it come from the word poison?
No.
Ra'al.
Ra'al, different word, yeah.
But it's also Resh Ayin Lamed.
Yes, but this is Ayin Resh Lamed.
Mm.
So what is Arel? What is Arel? Well, Arel is first used in this commandment. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Who's talking here? God, to whom? Abraham. So the flesh of your foreskin is your Orla.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and this becomes, so think of the word Arel is the opposite of mahul, circumcised. So when you are circumcised, right, you are mahul. When you are not circumcised, you are arel. You still have your orla. Okay? So now let's go back and here, and we could retranslate. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, and you would want to circumcise the tree from its fruit, you would want to cut the foreskin is not the right word, but the first growth of the tree, you can't. That first growth of the tree is forbidden to you, not to be eaten. So Orla, the word Orla is the same root, and in fact, basically the same usage as the Orla, that is the foreskin for circumcision. Now, the word then becomes a kind of signal, a distinction between Israelites and non-Israelites. We see, for example, in the story of the rape of Dinah, that Shimon and Levi refer to the heathens as the uncircumcised, arelim, right? So this becomes a category. We are the circumcised, and they are the uncircumcised, right? Okay, I just now we're gonna have to deal with what? So how does that connect to the agricultural law that we're looking at? But let me just give you one other usage of it, just to show you that it doesn't always mean literally circumcision, because Moses also uses the term just to refer more metaphorically to God saying, Ani arel sfatayim, I am of uncircumcised speech or occluded lips. How then shall Pharaoh heed me? So Moses, who seems to have problems speaking or a speech impediment, refers to himself as uncircumcised of my lips. I'm occluded, right? Whether that was a physical, like his lips were actually blocking his speech, or he just a metaphor, like I don't speak well. Okay, but now you see, this is a term. This word has a kind of meaning, which is like it's the blockage of the kind of the growth that can be cut off for further unimpeded growth. Okay, but like, okay, what is going on here? I mean, like, what's the connection between the circumcision and the cutting of a plant? And is it just technical, or do we see these somehow as like expressing some similar value? All right, let me see. Is anyone want to jump in who hasn't spoken yet? Okay, all right, then I'm going to turn back. I'll try to take the order and go back to Matt.
I'm guessing me. I've been thinking about what Jonathan said, and it seems so right. This seems to be one more of the firsts. It's the firstborn and the first fruit and the first stuff, and it's again the separation that matters here. With living things, it's breath and blood that matters, and with this, it's just first and after. And God wants us to separate and make special. But in this case, the special is the stuff we get, the stuff we eat. So it's not the first, but it seems to me it's thematically connected to what we were doing before, that it's still the first thing that we're caring about and separating out and noticing.
Okay, great. So Matt is exactly right that we can make this link between circumcision and this commandment of Orla, but it's not a direct parallel, right? Like the idea is that for circumcision, we get rid of the tip, right? The first growth, the foreskin, and get rid of that in order to reveal something or be something, right? Like the idea is to and same with Moses's usage. It's like, this is the thing blocking. This is the thing that is like to be discarded. But with Orla, it's a little bit like if we have been on the right track so far, which is that the first growth is to be like left alone as God's growth and not to be touched and to be respected, then it doesn't have a negative or blocking connotation, does it? In fact, so far, all of our firsts in agricultural law, Matt is quite correct to say, have been for God. It's for you, right? So how does that work? Like, it seemed like for God, we cut off the Orla in circumcision, but now for God's sake, we don't touch the Orla. So there's like not quite there's like a sort of inverse logic there. All right, who wants to pick up on this? I'm gonna keep going. Rosa.
So actually, I just want to go back to Moses because there is a condition called tongue-tied. And the way they handle that is they cut whatever it is that's blocking the tongue. So that really does tie into circumcision. I don't know how that ties into the fruit, but I can understand how Moses's tongue could be described as uncircumcised.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think Moses is using it in a way that seems like to reflect the original usage, the circumcision usage. But Orla, in some ways, seems like, oh yeah, it's about the growth and the cutting off of but it doesn't seem to have the same logic as circumcision. There's something else going on. So Elaine, I see a new hand. Elaine Lerman. Elaine, we can't hear you.
It seems to me that when you're talking about the fruit, that God doesn't want you to touch the fruit, to circumcise it, to take it off, because it is to him precious. it's got a certain religious connotation. It means that this is of God. If you cut it, if you circumcise it before it's ready, before I, as God, say it's ready, then you are cutting a part of me before I tell you to. So I think God's trying to say that you can't do it because I told you not to. This is the law. This is what I said. And that, you know, if you circumcise the fruit, you take it off, you're taking off a part of me. It's as if the tree is God, because it's from the earth, and God, everything is God's.
Yeah, what a wild thought. Circumcising God. I mean, I think you're right that the sentiment here seems to be, hey, we want to leave this whole, uncut, right? And, but again, that seems different than the impulse for the original impulse for circumcision, which is it should be cut. But maybe one of the things Elaine said is maybe it's that it should be left uncut before it is ready. And then you could say, well, I guess they don't circumcise a baby boy on the first day, but it's only 8 days later. So like there you could draw a parallel and say, well, just like a baby boy Israelite has to wait for 8 days, so this tree has to wait for 3 years, and that's the parallel. But it seems very, I mean, 3 years is quite a wait.
But it's not mature yet, and so you have to wait until the trees are mature.
Okay.
My father-in-law had a grove of fruit. And that was the thing. You don't take the fruit off until the tree is mature.
Okay, but if we were going to do that, then we would follow the practice, by the way, of some Muslim communities who wait till the boy is mature, right? Like wait till 13, right? And circumcise the boy then, right? The boy doesn't seem mature at eight days. All right, let's play with this just a little bit more, and then we'll move forward. Marianka? We can't hear you.
I'm saying it's more like a question wandering through my mind, because in the 4th year, you take the fruit as an offering to God. And we know that we're offered the firstborn, the first fruit, which would kind of indicate to me that in the first 3 years, that those fruit are not really truly born, like from, since you plant the seed of the tree, and then it grows, right? And in terms of tree life, the tree isn't really born until it's 3 years old.
Okay, that's pretty good. Actually, making some sense of Elaine's comment just now. Marianka provides some support to the logic that the tree is a baby. It's not ready yet, and trees can live for hundreds of years. So it's 8 days, right? There is some parallel there. Okay, all right. Let's just summarize where we've been so far. We have this commandment of Orla, not to cut down not to take the fruit from trees that were planted after the Israelites entered into the land of Israel, and don't do that for the first 3 years. And then in the 4th year, I guess you have a kind of a circumcision, right? I don't know what other word to use, but a first trimming, right? Part of which goes to God, right? Which parallels some of our other agricultural laws. And then the 5th year, it's just a regular tree. And we're trying to think about why is that? And some of it does seem like, well, it's tribute to God. But now we have this other echo that reminds us of circumcision, which after all, circumcision is not just a random commandment. It is spoken of as the symbol of the covenant, right? That shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Well, that's a big deal. I mean, it's a weird commandment, obviously, but it's a big one. It was given to Abraham. And as Moses used it, we see that it also has like a kind of a general meaning, which is that there's an occlusion and it is to be cleared away. Okay? Now, that in itself is good and interesting discussion. But now I want to return us to what was the initial concern of the Mishnah, which is, when is this applicable? And in some ways, we've already answered that question. It is applicable when the Israelites cross over into the land of Israel. And we have assumed, or at least I assumed, that that is true once they cross over and forever, but it is true in the land of Israel, right? It's not, once they cross over, it's not like now all trees in the world need to be left untended. Although, I forget who it was at the outset that wondered if maybe that is the point. Maybe it's whenever an Israelite plants a tree. Did a clock get started as soon as the Israelites crossed over into the land of Israel, but now it applies anywhere you are? Or does this mitzvah apply, as most agricultural mitzvot do, only in the land of Israel? Now, I would just assume that was the case. I would assume so far that we're just talking about what goes on in the holy land of Israel. Okay, and so whatever happens there, it is part of a larger agricultural system that acknowledges God, and this particular expression of it may also echo the covenant of circumcision in some way. But at the very end of the Mishnah, in the last Mishnah, there's a discussion over whether this commandment applies outside of the land of Israel. And take a look at what they say, because I think it gives us some real pause to reflect on this whole idea that there are certain commandments that only take place in the land. So take a look at the last Mishnah here. The last Mishnah says, doubtful Orla, meaning I'm not sure if this fruit came from an Orla tree or not. Well, in the land of Israel, you can't eat that. Now, that seems obvious, right? We said you can't eat fruit from the first 3 years of a tree in the land of Israel. And so they're just adding here, yeah, and even if you're not sure whether it came from a tree in that period, still, in the land of Israel, you can't eat it. But in Syria, you can. Okay, that shouldn't be surprising. We learned last week that Syria is considered like the first step out of Israel, the first country right outside of Israel. And in the first country right outside of Israel, if you have this doubtful, you don't know whether it came from a tree within its first 3 years or not, don't worry, you can still eat it. Now, this discussion should already tell you that something weird is going on, because what do you mean? If I'm in Syria, can't I just eat anything anyway? I could eat it straight from the tree, even if I knew it was from the tree, right? Well, not so fast, because the Mishnah starts by talking about this sort of, well, what if you don't know it's from the tree, a young tree? And then the Mishnah starts talking about all of the laws that apply only in the land of Israel, and then kind of takes it back. So here are 3 examples of laws that we thought only applied in the land of Israel that are now being reconsidered. Okay, so here they are. One is the law of new produce. New produce is prohibited by the Torah in all places, meaning in Israel or not in Israel. Now, I'll read the rest, but we're going to go back and look at what this means. Orla is a halacha, and kilayim is an enactment of the scribes. Okay, if that's not clear, it shouldn't be yet. Let's just, for a moment, consider this new produce law. Okay, new produce is this law here in Leviticus that once again begins with the phrase, when you enter the land. Now, when I hear that phrase, when you enter the land, I read, oh, this only applies in the land of Israel. And when you enter the land, the law is you, until the day of the first fruit offering, until you've brought the offering to your God, you shall eat no bread or parched grain or fresh ears. You don't eat any new produce. It is a law for all time throughout the ages. But then it says, b'chol moshvotechem, in all your settlements. Now, if I was reading this in the Torah, I would think all your settlements in Israel, right? That makes sense, right? In all your settlements in Israel, you don't eat new produce until you have offered the first fruit. But the Mishnah has decided to read it differently. The Mishnah has said that new produce is prohibited by the Torah everywhere, not just in Israel, but everywhere. And they're relying on this phrase here, in all your settlements. Even though this seems to be an agricultural law that applies when you enter into the land, actually, this law of not eating new produce until, basically until Shavuot, this law applies everywhere. Okay, now, what about Orla? Well, Orla is a halacha, meaning the law is, says the Mishnah, that Orla also applies everywhere. But we don't have a source for that in the Torah. It doesn't seem like it applies everywhere, but the Mishnah is telling us it's just a law that we have. Just a law. In fact, the full phrase is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. This is just a law that Moses got at Sinai. And just trust us. This applies everywhere. And that's basically what the Mishnah is saying. This is just a law. No further questions, right? And then finally, just one more category, kilayim, which we've studied before. Kilayim is the, what did you call it earlier, Yonatan? The crossbreeding or the mixing of plants. That applies only in the land of Israel, but the scribes, meaning later scholars, decided, you know what? We're going to make that forbidden also outside of the land of Israel. Now, what I've just explained, obviously, is rather complicated. So let me just say it simply. There are many agricultural laws, and they generally only apply in the land of Israel. Okay? That seems to be the obvious reading of the Torah. However, one of those laws has a little phrase that allows us to think of it as something that applies everywhere. And the rabbis keep going, and they tell us, actually, Orla also applies everywhere. And in fact, kilayim, even though it doesn't apply everywhere, we're going to make it apply everywhere. Okay? So the Mishnah, which starts out by basically introducing the concept that Orla is something that we do when we cross over into the land of Israel. And as we looked at that commandment, it seemed obvious to us that it only applied in the land of Israel. At the very end of the Mishnah, there's a kind of a taking back of that principle and saying, no. We have a tradition that Orla applies everywhere. Okay? And just to give you a sense of how strange and yet strangely heated this debate is, take a look at rabbis continuing to argue this point very fiercely in the Talmud. Okay? And this is the last text that we'll look at, because what I'm going to ask you is to try and figure out what the heck is going on here. But take a look at this record of the debate in the Talmud. The sharp sages of Pumbedita, okay, the Charifei de Pumbedita. The sharp sages of Pumbedita, which was in Babylon, said that the prohibition of Orla does not apply at all outside of the land of Israel. Okay, that makes sense. It doesn't apply outside the land of Israel. But that must not have been a settled debate, because Rabbi Yehuda sent a question to Rabbi Yochanan concerning the halacha, the law, with regard to Orla outside of the land of Israel. And Rabbi Yochanan sent him the following response: conceal the law that produce whose Orla status is uncertain is permitted, and destroy produce whose Orla status is certain. Meaning, we just learned that if you're in the land of Israel and you don't know if this fruit is Orla, then you can't eat it. But if you're outside of the land of Israel, you can. And Rabbi Yochanan says, don't teach people that. Don't conceal it. Hide that law. And when it comes to actual, that's for a doubtful fruit. But when it comes to fruit that you know within its first 3 years, that is going to apply everywhere. And he says, people who don't do this, whoever says there is no prohibition of Orla outside of the land of Israel will have neither a child nor a grandchild who will carry the lion of holding the land in the congregation of the eternal. In other words, he says, if you don't keep Orla outside of the land of Israel, you will never return to the land of Israel. You will never inherit the land of Israel. Okay, I know this has been complicated, but where have we arrived? We've arrived at the rabbis taking a law that presumably only applied in the land of Israel and then kind of rewriting it so that it applies also outside of the land of Israel. And their answer to why is just, that's the way it is. It's just a law that we have. It seems like it applies only in the land of Israel, but it applies everywhere. And actually, if you don't keep it outside the land of Israel, then you're going to be doomed somehow. So what is going on here? Why are the rabbis having this tense debate where on the one hand, some of them are saying, yeah, this is only for the land of Israel. And then other rabbis are kind of taking it back and saying, no, it applies everywhere. Okay? So that's the question we'll end with. David, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think that it, is thinking about the rule and then the reference to the circumcision, but circumcision clearly at the time differentiated the Jewish people from the rest of the people that they were around. And in a world in which the Jewish people are now outside of the land of Israel, outside of their political state, where they're homogenous to some degree, and going into other places where they're amongst the non-Jewish people, this was a way, this is a rule that's employed in some way to differentiate Jewish people from the greater population in the same way that the circumcision had done beforehand. And it's, I think about the experience of somebody who is trying to follow this in a land in which they're not the majority, and it really does take you out of the society in a large degree, and it imposes on you as a person a burden to some degree of being different, and noticeably so. Whereas there are a lot of different markers for being different, as in Jewish practice, circumcision tends to be hidden, and so this was a very overt differentiation.
Okay, David makes a brilliant connection. Says that, remember, this law is sort of linguistically related to circumcision. Now, circumcision applies wherever you are, right? Whether you're in Israel or not Israel. In fact, the law was given to Abraham before any of this started. And it is the law that ends up distinguishing between the Israelites and non-Israelites, not in the land of Israel, but anywhere that they are. So David begins to speculate that the rabbis may have felt that connection and wanted to carry the same basic principle of distinction into this other circumcision named law, right? For some of the reasons that he gave. All right, let's continue to build on this. Kathy?
Yeah, this is maybe a slightly different direction, but I keep thinking that this sort of obsession with what you can eat and what you can't eat, and these forbidden trees and everything, it just, brings me back to the Garden of Eden and the forbidden fruit there. And so I'm wondering if people make that kind of connection to that forbidden fruit. I mean, I don't know. And I particularly think of that because of yours and Rabbi Browse's discussion last week at Limud Tzedek on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And one of the ideas I thought was really interesting was this idea that somehow maybe it wasn't to be forbidden forever, but that there was more of a sense that people weren't ready for it yet, that they shouldn't eat from it, but that there could be this change over time where eventually we were supposed to be able to eat of it. Yeah, I don't know. I thought that was really interesting last week. And so it kind of really ties to this, where you can't eat it now, but it's okay to eat it later.
Okay. Another brilliant connection here. Now, interesting. This Torah starts with a law of not eating from the fruit of a tree, right? And Kathy brings us back to the Garden of Eden, and in doing so, brings us back to the universal story of humanity. And so I think by implication, Kathy raises for us a kind of a big picture question as to what the laws of the Torah are for, or what is the Torah for? Is it a kind of a collection of basic principles that always apply? Or do we have this whole category of laws that are very specific to the settling of the land and the existing in the land and the being in the land? And that seems true. On the face of it, it seems like, well, there's a whole body of laws that apply in the land of Israel. That's just, they're geographically bound. And in fact, they're bound to a certain era, right? They start at a certain point. But Kathy wonders, and I think rightly, if there isn't some kind of sense that maybe the rabbis have that, no, if this is meaningful, it's meaningful everywhere. And you can maybe hear the rabbis wanting to link all of the stories of the Torah and the messages of the Torah, starting with the Garden of Eden, but like moving through Abraham. And after all, this law has a direct connection to Abraham. The name of the law takes us back to Abraham's foundational covenant. So there is an impulse, isn't there, to kind of see all of the laws of the Torah as universally applicable, or at least applicable to Israelites in a universal way wherever they are, right? You can sort of see that we're not going to end knowing exactly why the rabbis are debating this, but you can sort of feel certain tensions emerging in their consideration of what do we do with all these laws that basically don't apply to us anymore. Okay, let's take one last comment from Jen.
I'm thinking about that phrase, when you enter into the land, and that crucial moment of crossing over into the land of Israel and having a brand new relationship with the land around you. And how it sounds like moving forward, they're reproducing that moment every time you enter into the land to plant a tree, every time you start a new relationship with the land. So I'm wondering if they're also creating this experience of every time I do something with the land, regardless of whether I'm in Israel or not, I'm also experiencing crossing over into a new moment of relationship, or a sanctified moment with the land that I'm working.
Yeah, great. And that is a beautiful articulation of the other possibility, which is that there's a reason why these commandments are land-based, and not just land-based, but the land-based. Like they're tluyot ba'aretz, they're rooted in the particular relationship that the Torah seems to want us to have with this particular land, which after all is the promised land that God took us out of Egypt to deliver us to. So what we're going to kind of have to leave off on now is a lingering tension that I think does exist in the Torah over whether we are being asked to have a relationship with nature and plants and farming, which and that relationship would have something to do with what Yonatan said at the outset, recognizing God's role in our sustenance and life here on this earth, which goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Or are some of these laws, no, they're not about just a human's relationship to the earth, but rather a Jew's relationship to this particular quadrant of the earth, right? And it's not entirely clear, because there are little moments where it seems like the agricultural laws would apply outside of the land. And so the rabbis are taking those little clues, and you can see a certain strain in the rabbinic tradition that wants to make them apply all outside, make them all apply outside the land. But let's not forget, and David was beginning to articulate this, that if really we had to keep all of the agricultural laws of the Torah wherever we were, that would be a tremendous burden. That would be almost impossible, right? What would it mean to walk around being careful not to ever eat the fruit of any tree within its first 3 years and going to the market and asking? It doesn't actually make sense, right, that we would import these laws wherever we were, and yet there is a kind of, I can understand the impulse to make these laws a little bit bigger, because after all, these are rabbis who are dealing with the beginning of what will be a long period outside of the land. And that is the question they're asking, and I think the question that we have to ask as we move towards the end of this agricultural section of the Mishnah, which is like, this is a part of our sacred tradition. These are holy laws that we got from the Torah. What do we do with them now? Right? So I'll leave that question hanging in the air, and we will meet again next week for probably our last agricultural class before we turn into the laws which do apply no matter where we are, the laws of the holidays. Okay? So see you next week. Everybody have a wonderful week.